The scent of aged linseed oil and damar varnish was the only constant in Alara Vance's world, a fragrant ghost that clung to her clothes and hair long after she left the climate-controlled silence of the art vault. At 23, she lived her life within the hushed, hallowed halls of the Thorn Corporation's private collection, a junior conservator tasked with mending the wounds of time. Her hands, steady and precise, moved with a practiced reverence over the cracked surface of a 17th-century portrait, each delicate touch of her brush a prayer for preservation. This was her sanctuary, a self-imposed exile where the only passions were pigment-deep, and the only dramas were sealed under layers of protective glaze. She found a quiet solace in restoring beauty others had broken, a desperate attempt to impose order on a world she knew to be inherently chaotic. Here, among the silent, watchful faces of the past, she could pretend the emptiness inside her was just part of the room's profound stillness. But what happens when that carefully constructed silence is shattered by the one man who owns it all? A man who sees her not as a restorer, but as another beautiful object to be possessed. Watch until the end to find out. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. This self-inflicted isolation was a fortress, built from the rubble of her childhood. Lara's parents had loved each other with a terrifying, all-consuming fire that ultimately burned their lives to the ground. She remembered the screaming matches that felt like physical blows, the sound of a shattering plate echoing the splintering of their family, and the suffocating passion that always curdled into venomous rage. From the ashes of their catastrophic union, Alara had forged a solemn vow. She would never allow such chaos to touch her. Her virginity was not a matter of morality or religion, but a shield, a deliberate choice to remain in untouched territory, safe from the destructive force of desire. She had witnessed firsthand that love was not a gentle flame, but a wildfire, and she was determined to never, ever let herself burn. Her life outside the vault was a study in deliberate monotony, a carefully curated landscape of beige and gray. Her small apartment was neat to the point of being sterile, her meals were simple and solitary, and her evenings were spent with books that offered escape without emotional risk. She moved through the world like a ghost, her presence so quiet it was barely a whisper. Working for the Thorn Corporation was her only tether to the realm of power and opulence, a world she observed from the safety of the archives, several floors below the executive suites, where deals were struck and dynasties were managed. She preferred the company of inanimate objects. They were predictable, their histories known, their demands non-existent. They could not hurt her, and more importantly, she could not hurt them. It was a small life, a safe life, a life she had meticulously designed to prevent pain. Yet, in the deepest, most guarded corners of her heart, a persistent ache resided. It was a quiet loneliness that pulsed beneath the surface of her controlled existence. Sometimes, while restoring a painting depicting a passionate embrace or a scene of heartbreaking farewell, a strange, unfamiliar longing would stir within her. It was a flicker of warmth in the cold expanse of her soul, a yearning for a connection she was too terrified to ever seek. She would quickly extinguish the feeling, reminding herself of the wreckage such emotions left in their wake. She convinced herself that this dull, constant emptiness was a small price to pay for safety, a manageable void far preferable to the sharp, shattering agony of a broken heart. The beautiful, tragic stories on the canvases were a warning, not an invitation. The vault itself was a perfect metaphor for her existence, a treasure trove of immense passion, history, and beauty, all kept under lock and key, protected from the ravages of the outside world. She handled masterpieces born from tempestuous love affairs, political upheaval, and profound human suffering, yet her touch remained clinical, her focus purely technical. She could expertly mend the fissures in a centuries-old landscape, seamlessly blending new paint with old to hide the scars of time. But she remained powerless to address the fractures within herself. The irony was a constant, silent companion in the dim light of the restoration studio. She was the careful keeper of a gilded cage, a silent warden for priceless artifacts, and in doing so had become just as much a prisoner as the art she so diligently preserved. Alara's physical presence mirrored her internal state. She was possessed of a delicate, almost ethereal beauty, that she took great pains to conceal beneath conservative blouses and shapeless cardigans. Her movements were fluid but hesitant, as if she were constantly apologizing for the space she occupied. Her large, expressive eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were often downcast, hidden behind a curtain of dark, straight hair. She was unaware of the quiet grace she exuded, the way her shy, infrequent smiles could illuminate a room. This cultivated invisibility was her armor. She had perfected the art of being overlooked, of blending into the background so completely that she was little more than a shadow. It was this very quality, this unassuming and authentic quietness, that made her a dangerous anomaly in a world built on performance and pretense. The end of her day typically brought a sense of relief, the closing of the heavy vault door, a final, definitive seal against the world. But tonight, a subtle disquiet settled in the air, a change in the atmospheric pressure that she could feel on her skin. It was in the unusual hum of the elevator, the distant, authoritative echo of hard-soled shoes on the marble floor, far above her subterranean sanctuary. A notification pinged on her computer, an email from an unfamiliar executive address. The subject line contained only 2 words: a meeting. It was a summons, devoid of pleasantries or explanation. The first stone had just been tossed into the placid, carefully maintained waters of her life, and Ilara felt a cold dread creep up her spine as she watched the ripples begin to spread, threatening to disturb everything. The journey home was a daily act of temporal and social whiplash. Ilara would step from the silent, refrigerated air of the Thorn Corporation's subterranean levels into the humid, breathing chaos of the city's evening rush. The subway car was a rolling microcosm of the life she had escaped, yet remained tethered to. A cacophony of languages, the smell of street food clinging to coats, the weary faces of people whose labor was etched into the lines around their eyes. She would hold a support pole with one hand, her knuckles white, feeling like a foreigner in her own life. The polished, quiet world of art conservation felt like a dream she had during the day, one that dissolved with the screech of the train's brakes at her stop. Here, in the press of the crowd, she was no one special, just another girl in a sensible coat, her profound knowledge of Flemish oil-glazing techniques utterly useless against the tide of humanity. Her apartment building stood on a street where the symphony of the city was played in a minor key, the distant wail of sirens, the rhythmic bass from a passing car, the murmur of conversation spilling from open windows in the summer. It was a 5-story walk-up of tired brick, its fire escapes zigzagging across the facade like old scars. The lobby smelled perpetually of damp concrete and a neighbor's overly spiced cooking. Lara moved through it with practiced quiet, her keys already in hand, avoiding eye contact not out of arrogance, but a deep-seated desire to remain unseen, to not invite conversation or inquiry. She knew the rhythms of the building, the arguments from 3B, the baby crying in 2A, the solitary shuffling of the old man on the first floor. It was a community she lived within but was not a part of, another gallery of human lives she observed from a safe, unbreachable distance. Inside, her small one-bedroom apartment was a testament to her need for order. Every book on the shelf was aligned by size, the few dishes in her kitchen were always clean and dry in the rack, and the single throw pillow on her modest sofa was perpetually centered. This was her dominion, the one place where every variable was under her control. But the sterility of the space offered no comfort, only a reflection of her own emotional emptiness. The silence here was different from the hallowed quiet of the vault. It was a thin, brittle silence, easily broken and heavy with loneliness. She would stand in the center of the living room, the city's muted sounds filtering through the window, and feel the full weight of her self-imposed isolation. It was a life built on a series of negations. No clutter, no noise, no complications, and ultimately, no real living. The inevitable ring of her phone would slice through the quiet, a sound she both dreaded and expected. It was her mother, Catherine, whose love was a form of relentless, anxious surveillance. The conversation always began with a practical inquiry about her day, but it was merely a preamble to the true agenda. "Are you eating enough, Ilara? You sound tired." Each question was a gentle probe, a search for cracks in the fortress Ilara had built around herself. Catherine's voice, raspy from a lifetime of worry and too many cigarettes, carried the weight of her own history, a history of a passionate love that had soured into a cautionary tale. She saw Alara's solitude not as a choice for peace, but as a dangerous symptom of a life unlived, a path leading to the same lonely end she now faced herself. The conversation would invariably shift to the two pillars of Catherine's anxiety: finances and Alara's future. "The payment for your father's medical bills is due next week," she would mention, her tone carefully casual, yet the implication was as heavy as a stone. This debt was the invisible chain that bound Alara to her high-paying but soul-crushing position at the Thorn Corporation. It transformed her passion for art into a grim obligation, a means to an end. Every delicate brushstroke she made on a priceless masterpiece was, in essence, an installment payment on a past tragedy. This financial pressure was a constant, humming beneath the surface of her life, reminding her that her choices were never truly her own. She was not just restoring art, she was single-handedly keeping her family's fragile financial world from shattering completely. Having established the practical necessity of the job, Catherine would then pivot to the emotional void she perceived in her daughter's life. "Mrs. Gable from next door was asking about you again." She'd begin. "Her son, Mark, the mechanic? Such a sensible, hard-working boy. He asked if you were seeing anyone." The suggestion was an annual tradition, a gentle but persistent push toward a life Alara found suffocating to even imagine. A life of predictable stability, of Sunday dinners and a mortgage on a small house in a quiet suburb. It was the exact opposite of her parents' volatile existence, and yet, to Alara, it felt like a different kind of prison. A safe, comfortable, well-lit cage where her soul would slowly atrophy from a lack of any real, vibrant color. Her mother's vision of happiness was her own personal nightmare. Alara would murmur non-committal responses, her fingers tracing the condensation on a glass of water, feeling the walls of her meticulously ordered apartment begin to close in. The pressure was a physical thing, a tightening in her chest. Her mother's words, meant to be loving and protective, felt like stones being piled one by one onto her spirit. She was being shaped, molded, and prepared for a future she did not want, by a woman who genuinely believed it was for her own good. The expectation to marry, to settle, to replicate a safer version of a traditional life, was a constant assault on her quiet rebellion, her virginity, her solitude. These were not just shields against pain, but also her only acts of defiance against a world that demanded she pair off and settle down, to file away the sharp, complex edges of her own being. She understood with a painful clarity that her mother's nagging came from a place of deep, unresolved trauma. Catherine had been consumed by her husband's fire and then left to sift through the cold ashes alone. Now, she saw passion as the enemy, a dangerous and unpredictable force. She championed stability and practicality because she had never known them. In Alara's quiet, self-contained existence, Catherine saw both a reflection of her own loneliness and a chance to prevent her daughter from making what she perceived as the same mistakes. She couldn't differentiate between Alara's chosen peace and the desolate emptiness that had been forced upon her. This knowledge made the pressure even harder to bear. It was a burden wrapped in the guise of love, a cage built from the best, most heartbreaking intentions. After hanging up, Alara would be left in a silence that was now thick with unspoken demands and her own roiling emotions of guilt, frustration, and a desperate yearning for escape. The apartment, her supposed sanctuary, felt tainted by the intrusion, its neatness now seeming less like control and more like a profound lack of life. She would walk to the window, the one that faced the glittering heart of the city, and stare at the distant monolith of Thorn Tower. It stood there, a beacon of immense power and wealth, a world away from her humble street. It was the source of the money that kept her family afloat, the place where she hid among beautiful, silent things. It was her gilded cage, and she was beginning to feel the cold, unyielding nature of its bars closing in around her. She was trapped between two impossible worlds. On one side was her mother's vision, a small, safe, predictable life that promised security at the cost of her own soul. On the other was the cold, opulent world of the Thorns, a place of immense power where she was a ghost, a functional but invisible cog in a massive, indifferent machine. Both paths felt like a kind of death. She was a conservator, a mender of broken things, yet her own life felt fractured beyond repair, caught in a state of suspended animation. As she watched the lights of the city twinkle like fallen stars, A profound sense of hopelessness washed over her. She was being prepared for a life, but it wasn't her own, and she had no idea how to fight for one that was. The impersonal summons glowed on her monitor, a stark, black-and-white directive that felt like a crack in the foundation of her world. The meeting was not in a sterile boardroom upstairs, but here, in her sanctuary, in the art vault. The location was a clear statement of power. He was not summoning her to his world. He was invading hers. Ilara spent the next hour in a state of suspended dread, her hands, usually so steady, trembling slightly as she cleaned her brushes. She tried to focus on the familiar ritual, the smell of turpentine and the soft drag of bristles against a cloth, but her heart hammered against her ribs in a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. The air in the climate-controlled vault, normally a source of calm, felt suddenly thin and suffocating, charged with an alien energy. Every distant sound from the hallway above, a closing door, the ding of an elevator, sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through her. The vault itself, usually a place of quiet reverence, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. The portraits on the walls, with their painted, unblinking eyes, felt like a silent audience awaiting the start of a play. Ilara stood near her workstation, a small island of meticulous order in the vast, dimly lit space. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, expectant, amplifying the sound of her own ragged breathing. She felt an absurd urge to hide, to shrink behind a 16th-century tapestry or disappear into the shadows between the massive storage racks. She was a creature of the quiet and the dark, a restorer of things that could not speak or judge. The imminent arrival of Julian Thorne felt like the introduction of a predator into a carefully balanced, fragile ecosystem. She smoothed the front of her simple work smock, a useless gesture of composure that did nothing to quell the storm inside her. The silence was finally broken not by a voice, but by the precise, rhythmic click of hard-soled shoes on the polished concrete floor beyond the vault's entrance. The sound was confident, unhurried, each footfall an assertion of ownership. The heavy steel door hissed open, revealing a figure framed in the harsh fluorescent light of the corridor. Julian Thorne did not step into the room so much as he consumed the space. He was taller than she had imagined from the rare corporate photos, his presence an almost physical force that seemed to alter the room's temperature, making it colder. His suit was a masterpiece of dark charcoal tailoring, a severe silhouette that seemed carved from shadow and immense wealth. He paused at the threshold, his gaze sweeping the room with an air of detached appraisal, an emperor surveying his domain. In that moment, Ilara felt a fear so profound it was almost reverent. She was not an employee, but another artifact catalogued in the vast inventory of his possessions. He moved past her without a glance, his attention captured by a newly acquired Renaissance piece resting on a nearby easel. His profile was sharp, unforgiving, like something stamped onto a Roman coin, a strong jaw, a straight nose, and a mouth that looked as if it had never formed a genuine smile. His dark hair was cut with severe precision, not a single strand out of place. He was the living embodiment of the corporation that bore his name, powerful, immaculate, and utterly unapproachable. Ilara remained frozen, feeling her carefully constructed invisibility evaporate under the sheer weight of his presence. He exuded an aura of profound, chilling loneliness, the kind that emanates from men who have everything and therefore trust nothing. It was a coldness that went beyond mere aloofness. It was a deep, structural part of him, as integral as the bones beneath his skin. "The Veronese," he said, his voice a low baritone that resonated in the quiet room, startling her. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. He ran a single, long finger along the gilded frame, a touch that was both possessive and strangely devoid of passion. "The restoration work is adequate." The word hung in the air, a backhanded compliment that felt more like a judgment. He still hadn't looked at her. He was speaking to the room, to the painting, to himself. Ilara's throat was tight, her voice a trapped thing she couldn't release. She could only nod, a small, jerky movement he likely didn't even see. The power imbalance was a chasm between them, so vast she felt she could fall into it and never be seen again. He was the master of this universe, and she was just a ghost who tended to his ghosts. Then, slowly, he turned. His eyes, the color of dark, cold slate, finally settled on her. The gaze was not lecherous or even curious. It was intensely analytical, the look of a man assessing the value and utility of an object. He took in her plain work smock, her hair pulled back in a simple knot, her hands stained with pigment, and the undisguised fear in her wide eyes. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his expression, not contempt, but perhaps a detached interest in a specimen he hadn't noticed before. Under his scrutiny, Ilara felt every defense she had ever built crumble to dust. She was stripped bare, her shyness, her insecurity, her desperate need for safety, all laid out for his clinical inspection. She felt a strange, terrifying pull, the morbid fascination of a small animal caught in the unblinking stare of a hawk. "There is an event," he stated, his tone shifting from art appraisal to business. "The Thorn Foundation Gala. It is a tedious but necessary performance. A room full of sycophants, rivals, and potential partners, all of whom expect a certain presentation from me." He walked slowly toward her now, closing the distance between them until only her restoration table separated them. He rested his hands on the edge of the table, leaning forward slightly, his proximity, an invasion of her personal space that made her skin prickle with alarm. "The women in my circle are predictable. They are calculating, ambitious, and they perform their roles as tirelessly as I perform mine. I find their brand of artifice exhausting." His words were laced with a deep, weary cynicism that gave her the first glimpse of the man behind the corporate armor. He straightened up, his gaze never leaving her face. "For this event, I require something different. I require a companion who is not part of that world. Someone who is unknown, unobtrusive. A presence, not a participant." The clinical nature of his words sent a chill down Ilara's spine. He was not asking for a date. He was procuring an accessory. "You will accompany me." It was not a question or a request. It was a command, delivered with the casual, absolute authority of a man who had never been told no in his entire adult life. He was informing her of a new, non-negotiable clause in her employment contract. The proposition was so audacious, so far outside the realm of her reality, that for a moment she could only stare at him, her mind a blank slate of shock. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. 1,000 protests died in Ilara's throat. To refuse was unthinkable. Her job, the only thing keeping her family financially afloat, hung in the balance. But to accept felt like a violation of her very soul. It meant stepping into the glittering, hostile world she had dedicated her life to avoiding. It meant standing beside this cold, powerful man, a man who represented the very emotional chaos she had sworn to never let touch her. She felt the bars of her gilded cage pressing in, colder and harder than ever before. She was being asked to become one of the beautiful, silent objects she cared for, to be put on display, owned and observed. The choice was an illusion. Her carefully curated safety was being dismantled piece by piece by the one man who had the power to do so. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Her gaze dropped to the floor, unable to meet the intensity of his. She could not speak the word yes, for it felt like a betrayal of every vow she had made to herself. But her silent acquiescence was enough. He saw it, registered it, and the matter was closed. "My assistant will contact you with the details," he said, his tone once again clipped and impersonal. The transaction complete, he turned without another word and walked out of the vault, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Ilara was left standing in the profound quiet, her heart hammering not just with fear, but with a terrifying, unwelcome flicker of anticipation. The predator had left the sanctuary, but he had marked her as his own, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would never be safe here again. The summons was followed not by a phone call, but by the arrival of a sleek black box at her apartment door. It bore no return address, only the embossed silver thorn crest. Inside, nestled in layers of midnight blue tissue paper, lay a dress the color of a deep twilight sky. It was a whisper of silk and chiffon, a stark contrast to the sensible cotton and wool that populated her closet. Running her fingers over the impossibly delicate fabric, Ilara felt a tremor of both revulsion and a dark, thrilling curiosity. This was not a garment. It was a costume, a skin she was being commanded to wear. It was the first physical manifestation of his invasion into her life, a beautiful, silken shackle delivered directly to her sanctuary. She felt like a specimen being prepared for display, the dress a label detailing her new, temporary classification, property of Julian Thorne. She stood before the cheap, full-length mirror on the back of her bedroom door, the dress pooling around her feet like liquid night. The woman staring back was a stranger, an elegant phantom who had no place in this small, beige room. The gown's expert tailoring clung to her form, revealing a delicate figure she had always tried to hide. Her pale skin, the gentle curve of her collarbone, the surprising grace of her posture, it was all on display, no longer shielded by shapeless cardigans. For a dizzying moment, she saw what he must have seen in the vault. Not a mousy conservator, but a blank canvas with untapped potential. The realization was terrifying. This transformation felt like a betrayal of her core principles, a violation of the quiet, invisible self she had so carefully constructed. Yet a treacherous, unfamiliar vanity stirred within her, a whisper of wonder at the beautiful woman in the glass. The ride to the gala was an exercise in suffocating silence. Ilara sat beside Julian in the back of his cavernous luxury sedan, the space between them a tangible entity, humming with unspoken tension. He stared out his window, his profile a rigid silhouette against the blur of city lights. Yet she felt the full weight of his awareness on her. The air was thick with the scent of his cologne, a clean, cold fragrance of bergamot and cedar, and the faint, sterile smell of new leather. She watched her own reflection in the tinted window, a ghostly image superimposed over his, their two separate worlds colliding in the dark glass. His proximity was an oppressive force, a gravitational pull that threatened to disrupt the very orbit of her existence. Every bump in the road, every soft shift of the car, made her hyper-aware of the few inches of empty space that separated her flesh from his. They arrived not at a door, but at a maelstrom of light and sound. The sudden glare of camera flashes was a physical assault, a series of white-hot explosions that left colored spots dancing in her vision. The low roar of the waiting crowd was a wave of noise that threatened to drown her. Just as a primal instinct to flee seized her, Julian's hand settled on the small of her back. The touch was not gentle or reassuring. It was a firm, possessive anchor, a silent declaration of ownership to the ravenous eyes watching them. He guided her up the red-carpeted steps with an unhurried, almost regal pace, his body a shield against the press of the world. She felt like a captive being led into the arena, his touch both her cage and her only source of protection. Every step felt like a surrender, a deeper descent into a glittering, hostile world from which she might never truly escape. The grand ballroom was a breathtaking spectacle of gilded opulence and calculated power. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, casting a diamond-like shimmer over a sea of couture gowns and impeccably tailored tuxedos. The air buzzed with the murmur of 100 conversations, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the distant melody of a string quartet. This was Julian's natural habitat, a jungle of predators, where he was the undisputed king. He moved through the crowd with an effortless authority, his hand never leaving her back. He offered brief, dismissive nods to some, and engaged in clipped, low-toned exchanges with others. When he introduced her, his words were a study in minimalist control. "This is Ilara Vance." The lack of any further explanation, no title, no context, turned her into an enigma, a beautiful mystery that only amplified the speculative gazes that followed them across the polished marble floor. It wasn't long before the first challenger emerged from the crowd. Marcus Blackwood, a charismatic industrialist with silver hair and a reputation for corporate rating, approached them with a predatory smile. His eyes, however, bypassed Julian entirely, landing on Ilara with an appreciative, almost proprietary gleam. "Julian, you've been hiding a masterpiece," Blackwood purred, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. He extended a hand not to Julian but to Ilara. "Marcus Blackwood, it is an absolute pleasure." His charm was a tangible force, a slick and polished weapon designed to disarm and conquer. Ilara felt a cold knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She was being addressed as if she were a new acquisition, a rare painting Julian had just unveiled, and the blatant objectification made her skin crawl, even as she felt compelled by social convention to accept his handshake. Before she could fully process the interaction, Blackwood lifted her hand to his lips, his gaze still locked on hers over her knuckles. The gesture was overtly theatrical, a calculated move in the elaborate chess game of the city's elite. It was a direct and public challenge to Julian's dominance, a way of marking his territory on Julian's possession right in front of him. For Ilara, the brief, dry touch of the man's lips on her skin was a profound violation, an intimate act performed by a stranger without her consent. She froze, a deer caught in the headlights of a social collision she had no idea how to navigate. In that suspended moment, she felt the atmosphere around them drop several degrees. The subtle shift was terrifying. It was the chilling stillness of the air, just before a storm breaks, and she knew, instinctively, that the storm was Julian. A shadow fell over them. Julian moved with a speed and silence that was unnerving. His larger hand closed over both hers and Blackwood's, his grip a band of steel that was just on the edge of painful. The pressure was a clear, unambiguous message. Blackwood. Julian's voice was dangerously soft, a low rumble that cut through the ballroom's ambient noise. I believe Miss Vance and I were just on our way to the terrace for some air. It was not a request or an explanation. It was a dismissal. He extricated her hand from Blackwood's grasp and, without another glance at his rival, turned and propelled her toward the French doors, his fingers digging into her arm. The public mask of cold indifference had not just cracked. It had been utterly shattered, revealing the raw, possessive fury that lay beneath. The cold night air on the stone terrace was a welcome shock, but it did little to cool the searing heat of Julian's anger. They were alone, surrounded by manicured topiary and the distant, muted sounds of the city. He finally released her arm, but he cornered her against the balustrade, his body a formidable barrier between her and the party inside. "What did you think you were doing?" he hissed, his voice a low, brutal weapon. "You were supposed to be invisible, a shadow. Instead, you made yourself the center of his attention." The accusation was so profoundly unjust that it stole her breath. She had done nothing, said nothing, had merely existed in the way he had commanded, yet she was being blamed for the predatory actions of another man. She saw in his eyes a terrifying, irrational jealousy that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with his own wounded pride. A spark of defiance, long dormant and utterly unfamiliar, ignited in the face of his unfairness. She lifted her chin, her own eyes, wide and stormy, meeting his furious gaze without flinching. "I did nothing," she whispered, her voice trembling but laced with an unexpected steel. "I stood where you told me to stand. I wore the dress you gave me. I am not responsible for how other men look at me." The simple, unadorned truth of her words seemed to stun him into silence. He had expected tears, or perhaps a frightened apology. He had not expected this quiet, resolute strength from the timid girl from the archives. For the first time, he seemed to see past the object he had tried to create, and was confronted by the unwavering integrity of the woman who stood before him, refusing to be a scapegoat for his own demons. His fury seemed to collapse inward, imploding into something darker and more complex. The hard lines of his face softened almost imperceptibly, his rage replaced by a raw, unsettling confusion. "I know." He finally ground out, the admission sounding like it was torn from him. He took a step back, running a hand through his perfect hair, messing it for the first time. The gesture was a crack in his armor of control, a sign of the chaotic battle raging within him. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and in his slate-gray eyes, she saw not just possessiveness, but a flicker of something that looked shockingly like fear. He was afraid not of Blackwood, but of the intensity of his own reaction, of the savage, primitive emotion she had so effortlessly unleashed within him, a beast he had long thought tamed. They returned to the ballroom, but the air between them had been permanently altered. It was now charged with a dangerous, electric current of unspoken things. Julian stayed closer than ever, his presence a constant, searing heat at her side. He was a sentinel, his gaze sweeping the room, warding off any other potential threats with a look of cold finality. Ilara was acutely aware of every small movement he made, the way his knuckles brushed against hers when he reached for a drink, the low timbre of his voice as he spoke to a passing acquaintance. The fear had not vanished, it had simply changed its nature. It was no longer just the fear of a subordinate for her powerful boss. It was now entwined with a thrilling, terrifying awareness of him as a man, a dangerous and volatile force of nature to which she was inexplicably, irresistibly drawn. Later, a young, earnest curator from a rival museum attempted to engage her in a conversation about 15th-century pigment sourcing, his eyes bright with genuine professional interest. Before Alara could form a response, Julian stepped subtly forward, positioning himself as the focal point of the interaction. Alara's work is of course confidential, he stated smoothly, his tone leaving no room for argument. He then deftly pivoted the conversation to a recent acquisition of his own, effectively answering for her, speaking over her, and rendering her once again a silent, beautiful accessory at his side. He was not just protecting her from unwanted advances, he was systematically isolating her, cutting her off from any connection to the outside world, subtly reinforcing the invisible walls of the cage he was building around her, right there in the middle of the crowded room. And as she stood there, a silent observer to her own erasure, a deeply treacherous thought took root in Alara's mind. She should be horrified. She should be repulsed by his suffocating control, by his blatant treatment of her as a possession to be guarded. A part of her, the part that had sworn a vow of emotional abstinence, was screaming in protest. But another, deeper part of her, a part she never knew existed, was captivated. No one in her entire life had ever focused on her with such singular, all-consuming intensity. To be the object of Julian Thorne's complete and undivided attention was like standing in the heart of a storm. It was destructive, terrifying, and utterly, intoxicatingly alive. This raw, possessive focus was a dangerous poison, and she could feel herself beginning to crave another dose. The ride back was steeped in a silence even more profound than before. The city lights streaked past the window, a river of gold and silver, but Alara saw none of it. Her entire universe had contracted to the space within the car, to the powerful, silent man beside her. She noticed, with a jolt of alarm, that they were not heading back toward her modest neighborhood. The car was slicing through the heart of the financial district, moving inexorably toward the glittering black spire of Thorne Tower. A fresh wave of panic, mingled with a strange, electric hum of anticipation, washed over her. "Where are we going?" she finally managed to ask, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the engine's purr. Julian didn't turn his head, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "My home," he said, the two words landing like stones in the quiet car, a statement of fact that felt like a verdict. The private elevator ascended in unnerving silence, opening directly into his penthouse apartment. The space was vast, minimalist, and breathtakingly cold. Floor-to-ceiling windows on three sides revealed a panoramic view of the city. A glittering carpet of lights spread out below them like a conquered kingdom. The furniture was sparse and severe, all black leather, chrome, and glass. It was a space designed, not for living, but for observing the world from a position of untouchable power. It was the perfect reflection of the man himself, magnificent, commanding, and profoundly lonely. He walked past her without a word, shedding his tuxedo jacket and tossing it onto a chair with a weary gesture, the first sign of imperfection she had seen in him all night. He was finally, truly, out of the public eye. He stopped before the immense wall of glass, his back to her, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of his empire. The tension in the room was a physical presence, a pressure against her skin, making it hard to breathe. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice low and rough, directed at the city below. "Bringing you tonight was a mistake." Alara's heart sank, bracing for dismissal, for a cold return to her solitary life. But then he continued, his voice even lower. "Not because of them, because of me." He turned slowly, and the raw, unguarded emotion in his eyes was a devastating blow. The cool control was gone, replaced by a turbulent storm of conflict, and a desire so potent it seemed to suck the air from the room. His gaze held a silent, terrifying question. It was a choice. She could turn and flee now, back to the safety of her colorless world, or she could take a single step forward, into the heart of his darkness, and risk everything she had ever been. The choice hung in the air between them, as vast and glittering as the city sprawled beneath the window. Ilara's entire life had been a series of careful steps away from a moment exactly like this one, away from the chaos, the raw emotion, the devastating pull of another human being. She could see her old life from here, a distant, safe constellation of streetlights in a neighborhood far below, a world of quiet order and predictable loneliness. But Julian's confession, the raw admission of his own internal wreckage, had changed the equation. He was not just a cold, powerful force. He was a storm, and he was admitting that she was the lightning that had finally broken his control. With a breath that felt like her very first, she took a single, deliberate step forward, closing the space between them. It was a silent act of transgression, a willing step off the edge of the world she knew, and into the heart of his darkness. Her movement seemed to shatter a fragile stasis within him. He didn't lunge for her, as she might have expected. Instead, a flicker of profound shock, almost disbelief, crossed his features. It was as if he had laid out the terms of his own monstrosity, fully expecting her to flee, and her decision to move toward him was a variable for which his cynical, guarded heart had no calculation. The shock was quickly consumed by a wave of something far more potent and consuming, a dark tide of raw possession. He closed the remaining distance in 2 slow, deliberate strides, his sheer physical presence overwhelming her senses. He was no longer the CEO or the cold benefactor. He was a predator who had just watched his intended prey willingly walk into his den, and the sight had left him both undone and utterly captivated. This was a surrender he hadn't known he craved until this very moment. He reached for her, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his fingers made contact with her skin. The touch was not the firm, proprietary grip from the gala, but a shockingly gentle exploration, his thumb stroking the delicate line of her jaw. It was a silent question, a final offer of an escape she no longer wanted. The unexpected tenderness of the gesture was her undoing. It bypassed every rational defense, every scar from her parents, war, and spoke directly to the profound loneliness she had mistaken for safety. The slight roughness of his skin against hers was a jolt of reality, a reminder of the complex, flawed man beneath the immaculate armor. In response, she tilted her head, leaning into his touch in a gesture of complete and total surrender. Her eyes fluttered shut, and in that darkness she gave him her silent, unequivocal consent. The kiss was not a gentle beginning, but a cataclysmic event. It was the breaking of a dam, a desperate, hungry fusion that tasted of expensive whiskey, simmering fury, and a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical ache. He consumed her mouth with a raw, almost brutal force, one hand tangling in her hair, tilting her head back, while the other wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against the hard planes of his body. This was not the stuff of novels or daydreams. This was a violent collision of need and fear. All her vows of emotional abstinence, all her carefully constructed walls, were turned to dust and ash in the searing heat of his mouth. A dormant, wild part of her she never knew existed roared to life, and she found herself kissing him back with a matching desperation, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had just been torn from its foundations. He broke the kiss only to rest his forehead against hers, his breathing harsh and uneven in the silent room. His perfect glacial control was shattered, leaving behind the raw, fragmented pieces of a man in conflict with himself. "I shouldn't," he whispered, the words a ragged, desperate confession against her lips. The admission was more intimate than the kiss itself, a glimpse into the self-loathing that fueled his power. "I ruin beautiful things, Ilara. It's the only thing I've ever been good at." This was not a boast or a threat. It was a plea. He was showing her the jagged edges of his soul, the wreckage of his past, warning her that to stay with him was to invite her own destruction. He believed himself to be a poison, and in that moment of devastating honesty, he was trying to give her the antidote by revealing the full extent of his own damage. A fierce, protective instinct she had never felt before rose within her, silencing the fear. Instead of recoiling from his darkness, she found herself compelled to move closer to it. Her hands, which had been clutching his shoulders, slid up to cup his face, her thumb stroking the tense line of his jaw. She forced him to meet her gaze, to see the unwavering resolve in her stormy eyes. "Then, let me be the one you don't," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the turbulence of his confession. It was the ultimate act of defiance against her own history, against the cautionary tale of her parents' love. She was no longer just a conservator of broken art. She was offering to mend a broken man, knowing full well that the shards of his past could sever her own soul. In that moment, she was not submitting to him. She was choosing him in all his fractured, dangerous glory. A sound that was half groan, half surrender escaped his lips. With a swift, fluid motion that spoke of immense, restrained power, he swept her into his arms. He carried her as if she weighed nothing, moving from the cold, public expanse of the living room, the throne room of his empire, and into the shadows of his private chambers. The transition was a symbolic journey, leaving the world of glass walls and calculated observation for a space of genuine intimacy. His bedroom was darker, softer, dominated by a massive bed and a single, vast window that framed the city lights not as a conquered territory but as a distant, silent witness. He was taking her past the fortress walls, into the very heart of his solitude, a place he likely allowed no one else to enter. The air here felt different, heavier with unspoken histories and the ghost of a profound loneliness. He laid her gently on the cool, high thread-count sheets, his movements now filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. The act of undressing her was a slow, deliberate ritual. As he unzipped the twilight blue gown, the silken fabric felt like a second skin being peeled away, shedding the last remnants of the timid archivist, the fearful virgin, the girl who lived her life in shades of beige. He watched her with an intensity that was both breathtaking and terrifying, his gaze a mixture of raw hunger and something that looked achingly like awe. He was unmaking the perfect, silent object he had tried to create for the gala, and in doing so, he was finally confronted with the real, vulnerable, and utterly terrifying woman who had chosen to see past his monstrous facade. Every layer of clothing removed was a layer of her old life, her old fears, being discarded forever. Their first skin-to-skin contact was a jolt of pure lightning, a sensory overload that completely rewrote Ilara's understanding of intimacy. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of touch, taste, and sound. The brief, sharp pain of her body yielding to his was instantly eclipsed by a tidal wave of pleasure and a profound sense of emotional release that brought tears to her eyes. This was the fire she had spent her entire life running from, and she found herself wanting to be consumed by it. Through a haze of sensation, she saw the iron control in his eyes finally shatter, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability that mirrored her own. He said her name, not as a command or a statement, but as a desperate prayer, the sound of a drowning man who had just found something to cling to. In that moment, they were not a billionaire and his employee. They were simply Julian and Ilara, two broken souls forging a fragile, terrifying connection in the dark. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, the city's distant glow painting their bodies in soft strokes of silver and shadow. A new kind of silence settled over them, not the tense, charged quiet of before, but a shared, fragile peace. Ilara traced the sharp angle of his jaw, feeling the steady, calming rhythm of his heart beating against her cheek. The fear hadn't vanished. It was a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of this newfound intimacy, but it was now intertwined with the dizzying, terrifying knowledge that she had crossed a line. There was no going back to her small, safe life. She had willingly stepped into the flames. As Julian's arm tightened around her, a possessive, protective gesture even as he drifted towards sleep, she finally understood the truth. The gilded cage had slammed shut, its bars now forged from desire and a dangerous, nascent love. But for the first time, looking into the face of the man who held the key, she felt a terrifying hope that she was no longer its only prisoner. Ilara awoke to the cold, impersonal light of dawn, filtering through the penthouse's immense windows. The bed was a vast, empty expanse of white, the sheets cool, where Julian's body had been. She was utterly alone, a small, naked form in a cavernous room that smelled of him, of their night, and of a profound, sterile loneliness. The silence was the most brutal consequence, a deafening void where the raw, desperate sounds of their intimacy had echoed just hours before. The twilight blue gown lay on the floor, a discarded, silken husk of the woman she had been. She pulled the sheet around herself, a futile gesture of modesty in a space that had already witnessed her complete undoing. The city outside was awake and indifferent, a sprawling kingdom she had glimpsed from the top, only to be left behind in the silent, empty throne room. She found it on the severe glass table in the living room, not a letter, but a verdict, a single sheet of thick, corporate letterhead with a few stark, typed lines. It contained the number for a private car service and a single, blunt instruction: call when you are ready. There was no name, no warmth, no acknowledgement of the soul-altering event that had transpired between them. His passion, his confession, his terrifying vulnerability, all of it had been neatly tidied away, reduced to a logistical problem to be solved with the efficiency of a business transaction. The cold, impersonal nature of the note was a physical blow, a calculated dismissal that reclassified her from a partner in intimacy to an inconvenience to be removed. In the harsh light of day, she was not a woman he had connected with, but a secret to be scrubbed clean from his pristine, orderly existence. The ride back to her world was a journey through concentric circles of shame. She sat in the back of the silent black sedan, still wearing the rumpled gown from the night before, feeling like a counterfeit princess being returned to her hovel after the ball had ended in disaster. The car's luxurious leather was a cruel reminder of the world she had briefly touched. As it pulled up to her tired brick building, she saw the curtains of her neighbor's twitch. Mrs. Gable, her mother's chief informant, was sweeping her stoop, her gaze a mixture of shock and disapproval. Ilara fumbled with her keys, her hands trembling, feeling the weight of 100 imagined judgments. Her small apartment, once a sanctuary of quiet control, now felt like the scene of a crime, its threshold a finish line for a walk of shame she had never imagined she would have to endure. Inside, the oppressive neatness of her apartment felt like an accusation. Every perfectly aligned book on her shelf, every sterile surface, seemed to mock the beautiful, chaotic mess she had allowed her life to become. She tore off the gown, the silken fabric now feeling like a costume of her own humiliation, and threw it into a corner. In the shower, she scrubbed her skin raw, a frantic, futile attempt to wash away his scent, the memory of his touch, the ghost of his weight on her body. But the marks he'd left were not on her skin, they were branded onto her soul. The reflection that stared back from the steamy mirror was a stranger. A woman with haunted eyes and the faint purplish marks of a brutal passion on her collarbone. Guilt, cold and heavy, settled in her stomach. She had broken every vow, betrayed every principle, and traded her life's work of safety for a fire that had left her feeling not cleansed, but merely burned. Miles away, in a glass tower that scraped the sky, Julian stood staring at the same indifferent city. He had not slept. The cool, precise machinery of his mind was jammed, corrupted by the memory of her. The scent of her hair on his pillow, the quiet strength in her voice when she chose to stay, the terrifying, complete way she had surrendered to him. It was all a virus in his system, overriding the cold, logical code that had governed his life since his last betrayal. He felt a savage fury at his own weakness. He had allowed a variable he could not control into the equation of his life. The raw, possessive instinct he'd felt at the gala had mutated into something far more dangerous, a sense of connection, a feeling of vulnerability. To feel this was to be a target. His immediate primal instinct was to retreat, to cauterize the wound, to rebuild the fortress around his heart, making the walls higher and colder than ever before. The shrill ring of the phone was an intrusion she had been dreading. It was her mother, Catherine, her voice stripped of its usual gentle nagging and sharpened into a blade of panic and accusation. "Mrs. Gable saw you, Ilara," she began, the words tumbling out in a rush of shame. "Getting out of a black car this morning, in a ball gown. What have you done? Who is he?" The neighborhood's swift, brutal judgment had already been delivered. In her mother's traumatized worldview, Ilara was no longer a victim of circumstance but a willing participant in her own downfall, recklessly following in the footsteps of a passion that had ruined their family. Ilara had no words, no explanation that could possibly bridge the chasm of her mother's fear. The conversation ended with a chasm of silence between them, leaving Ilara more profoundly alone than ever before, condemned by the one person whose love was supposed to be unconditional. Returning to the art vault was like walking back into a memory. The hallowed quiet that had once been her comfort was now thick with the ghost of his presence, the echo of his command. Her sanctuary had been desecrated, first by his power and now by her own actions. The days bled into a week of deafening silence from him. No email, no summons, no shadow in the corridor. It was as if the night in the penthouse had been a hallucination. Her colleagues, however, knew something had changed. The whispers followed her like a shadow, their gazes a mixture of pity, envy, and contempt. She was no longer the invisible conservator. She was a spectacle, a piece of gossip. Her work, the meticulous mending of broken things, became a form of torture. Her hands, once so steady, now trembled, making the delicate act of restoration a cruel reminder of her own irreparable fractures. Julian, in turn, waged war against himself by waging war on his company. He became a phantom of cold efficiency, his presence in the boardroom, a chilling force that silenced all dissent. He worked with a brutal, relentless focus, driving himself and everyone around him to the brink of exhaustion. He was attempting to bury the memory of Ilara under mountains of paperwork, to drown out the sound of her voice with the roar of the market. But it was a losing battle. At night, alone in the vast emptiness of his penthouse, the silence was his enemy. He would find himself standing in the doorway of his bedroom, the scent of her still clinging to the air, a ghost of warmth in the sterile cold. The crumpled blue dress, which he'd been unable to discard, remained in his closet, a constant, maddening testament to the one beautiful thing he had possessed and immediately felt compelled to ruin. One evening, as Ilara sat in the dark of her small living room, the weight of his silence and her mother's judgment pressing down on her, something inside her finally broke. But it was not a collapse into despair. It was the cracking of a shell. Beneath the layers of guilt, shame, and fear, a tiny, hard kernel of anger began to grow. She was angry at his cowardice, for treating her soul like a corporate asset to be liquidated. She was angry at her mother for seeing only a reflection of her own past failures. But most of all, a righteous, burning anger rose against herself, for the years she had spent believing that a life without feeling was a life without pain. The night with Julian, in all its devastating consequences, had shown her a world of vibrant, terrifying sensation. It had hurt. It had broken her. But it had also made her feel profoundly, incandescently alive. With a newfound resolve that felt foreign and yet deeply authentic, she rose and walked to the corner where the twilight blue gown lay like a fallen flag. She picked it up, the silk whispering through her fingers, and held it. It was not a shroud of her shame, she realized, but a relic of her own courage. It was proof that she was capable of immense feeling, of desire, of taking a terrifying leap into the unknown. She carefully smoothed the wrinkles and hung it in her closet, not hidden in the back, but right in the front. It was a promise to herself. The fear of being destroyed by passion was slowly being eclipsed by a far greater terror, the thought of returning to a safe, silent, colorless existence. The cage had been cruel, but its bars had shown her the sky. He had slammed the door shut, but he could not erase the memory of flight. She would not go back to being a ghost. A month passed, a season of silent transformation. Ilara moved through the vault, not with the timid deference of a ghost, but with the quiet fire of a master in her own domain. The blue dress hanging in her closet was a private altar to her own courage, a daily reminder that she had survived the inferno and was no longer afraid of the heat. She worked on a new acquisition, a delicate porcelain statue with a hairline fracture running through its serene face, her touch more intuitive and confident than ever before. She was no longer just mending objects. She was communing with their resilience, with their capacity to endure damage and retain their beauty. And so, when she heard the footsteps approaching the vault, she did not freeze. This time, the sound was different, less the confident stride of a conqueror, and more the hesitant, uncertain tread of a pilgrim. She did not look up, but continued her work, her heart a steady, waiting drum against her ribs. He stood at the threshold, a dark figure framed by the harsh light of the corridor, and for a long moment he simply watched her. The suit was immaculate as always, but the man inside it was frayed at the edges. There were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and the severe, controlled set of his jaw seemed to be held in place by sheer force of will. He looked like a king who had discovered his throne was built on a fault line. When Alara finally did look up, her gaze was not one of fear or supplication. It was clear, steady, and questioning. She did not flinch or drop her eyes. She had been seen by him in her most vulnerable state, and in surviving his subsequent abandonment, she had shed her fear of his judgment. She simply watched him, her delicate restoration tools held loosely in her hand, waiting for the silence to break on her terms. He carried a small, unadorned box, holding it with a strange, almost awkward reverence. He stepped into the vault, the heavy door hissing shut behind him, sealing them once more in their shared, charged silence. "My penthouse is too quiet," he began, his voice rougher than she remembered, stripped of its usual corporate polish. I thought I preferred it that way. An absence of noise, of complication." He walked slowly toward her workstation, his eyes never leaving her face. "You were a complication, Alara. A disruption to the silence. And now that you're gone, the silence is all I can hear. It's deafening." He placed the box on the edge of her table, a stark, simple offering in the middle of her meticulously organized tools. It was a confession disguised as a statement, an admission that her absence had created a void far greater than the solitude he had once cherished. With a slight tremor in his hands, he opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was not a jewel or some priceless artifact. It was a small ceramic teacup, shattered and then painstakingly repaired with seams of brilliant gold. Alara recognized the art form instantly. "Kintsugi," she whispered, her voice filled with a professional awe that was quickly eclipsed by a wave of profound emotional understanding. "The philosophy of Kintsugi," Julian said, his gaze fixed on the beautiful broken object, "is that an object is more beautiful for having been broken. The damage is part of its history, something to be illuminated, not hidden." He finally lifted his eyes to hers, and in their slate-gray depths, she saw the full, unshielded landscape of his own fractures, his own history of damage, now offered to her not as a warning, but as truth. He was showing her his scars, traced in gold. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing one of the golden seams on the cup. The texture was smooth but uneven, a testament to both the violent break and the patient repair. It was the most honest, vulnerable thing he could have possibly shown her. It was an apology, a promise, and a plea, all contained within one small, imperfect object. "It's a difficult process," she said softly, her words carrying a double meaning that hung in the air between them. "It requires a very steady hand. Patience." He did not break her gaze. "I was hoping," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "that you had one." In that moment, the immense power imbalance that had defined their relationship dissolved completely. She slowly moved her hand from the cup and placed it over his, which still rested on the box. A silent, shared acknowledgement that this was their new beginning, two broken pieces, and the slow, patient work of mending. They stood like that for a long time, their hands clasped over the testament to beautiful repair, the silence of the vault no longer a cage but a sanctuary. It was not a grand declaration of love, but something quieter, stronger, and more real. It was an acceptance of flaws, a shared willingness to begin the meticulous work of healing. The future was an unwritten page, filled with uncertainty and the potential for pain, but for the first time it was also illuminated by a fragile, golden hope. If their journey from a gilded cage to a fragile hope has touched your heart, and you believe in the power of second chances, we invite you to become a part of our community. Subscribe for more stories that explore the beauty in our scars, share this with someone who needs to see it, and let us know in the comments what true connection means to you.